Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. Games Workshop kindly sent me some of the new Empire Wizards along to take a little look at it and do some painting. So look out for some unboxings in shorts over the next few days on the channel. But in this video, I'm going to be concentrating on the Battle Wizard and showing you how I painted mine.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems and offer custom items to suit your club, your event or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description. Out of all the releases for the new Empire of Man for Warhammer the Old World, I think this Battle Wizard and Familiar is by far my favourite one. And I need a wizard on foot with Familiar for my Nuln army project, which I'm aiming to get done for the Throne of Skulls tournament in Nottingham at Warhammer World at the end of February. So this is very much part of my Warhammer challenge. So let's get to it. Miniatures are primed black the way I normally do, and then I'm going to start building up some layers with zenithal with the airbrush. And if you're not an airbrush user, what I'd recommend if you want to follow the rest of the tutorial is to maybe use a grey primer. So what I'm going to do here is, rather than just white, I'm building up with grey first and then I'm going to build up with some white afterwards. And the reason for doing that is I want to make this miniature quite light. The rest of my army is Nuln, so there's loads of black going on, as you can imagine, and this is my excuse to paint a miniature in a different colour and make it stand out in the army. The studio paint job is lots of blues, very, very nice. But I've decided I'm not going to go down the route of blue. I wanted to go down a route of some sort of blue hints to it, but also some greens and things as well, and make it quite light and pastel-like. So by building up with the airbrush first, a few layers of greys, mostly top down, that's what you're trying to achieve with the zenithal. I'm leaving some black in the undercuts, so you're getting a very grayscale looking miniature at the end of the day, but it'll really help me with the painting style I'm going to use, with lots and lots of glazes on this miniature. And I'm going back in afterwards with the white and really being delicate, building it up, trying to build those shades in already. So I'm doing it all with the airbrush, and I can get those highlights showing through the thin layers that I put on using contrast paints and inks and things like that later on. Exactly the same method followed through for the Familiar as well. He's got loads of detail on there, and we're going to make the most out of that detail also by dry brushing. So I'm going to use a white paint. Doesn't really matter what white you use, one of your favourite from the range. I'm using white staff here from Two Thin Coats, putting a little bit on my dry palette here. This is a texture palette from Knott's Hobbies, and I'm using a Knott's Hobbies dry brush. If you do want to check those out, there's a link in the video description below and you get a little bit of a discount. But what I'm really trying to achieve here is hardly any paint on that brush, really just picking out the details so they really show through when I add those glazed layers. I don't want any streaking or marks on there, so I've pretty much removed all of the paint from my brush here, and lots of little circular motions trying to just pick out the detail to boost it, keeping it away from those flatter areas. So I don't want to ruin any of those nice gradients that I've put in with the airbrush. And there we have it, and you probably can't see it very well with the lighting on the video, but these are quite nicely graded zenithal miniatures, lots of greys and blacks in the undercuts, as you can just about see there, and lots of the details picked up with the dry brushing. For my skin recipe, I'm going to be using contrast Guilliman flesh as the base colour, and then Shyish purple, Vulpus pink and Orc flesh, all contrast paints as well, to add some extra tones to that flesh colour. First off, we're starting with a nice even coat of the Guilliman flesh, enough to run into those recesses to really get the benefits of a contrast paint, but also not too much that is pooling on the flat areas. I want to make use of that zenithal and that dry brush to show through the thinner contrast style paint, so you get a really nice effect to start with without adding any highlights and things as yet. We will come back to that later. So I'm adding it to all of the face areas on both miniatures, obviously the hands as well. The next stage is to come in with the Shyish purple and use that as a shade. So I'm adding that around the flesh area which touches the cuff where the shadow would be. Also in between the fingers, you can add it into the recesses for the eye sockets, around the top where any head wear would be. You get the idea where it would be a little bit darker when there's a shadow there, and it just adds a nice little bit of tonal depth to it. After that, we've got the Vulpus pink, which is a warmer colour, and I like to add that around the cheekbones, lips, over the end of the nose, sometimes on the fingers, on the tops of the hands as well. Now I want this old gentleman to look quite ragged. I want his skin to look really weathered and old. So I'm adding some green as a very light filter. These are thinned on my wet palette. All of these paints are. Just a little bit to make sure they don't overpower. But adding this green filter, it does darken the skin quite a lot. But as I said, I want it to look old, look like he's been out in the weather. He's been around for a long time. Maybe his life is prolonged by his magic. At this point, I like to paint in my eyes before I finish off that skin, so if I make any mistakes, I'm not going to have to go back and redo the skin again. Now I'm using Elven Skin here, which is a top highlight for a triad for the Two Thin Coats range of paints. You can use any kind of light skin colour here. And I'm just picking out some little spot highlights here, so the tops of the cheekbones, ends of the nose, that kind of thing, just to make it pop a little bit more. Because you've got that zenithal undercoat and that dry brushing and those thin glaze layers, you've already got a nice gradient between shading and light and dark and things on the skin anyway. It looks quite cool, but this just kind of tidies it up and makes it pop. It doesn't look like you've been using contrast paint by the time you finish this with all those other stages, but you're doing so little actual brushwork when it comes to the highlighting, and I really like painting this way. This is contrast gut ripper and some contrast medium as well. I'm going to be using this on my wet palette with water as well, so I've got it to a nice smooth consistency. And the idea now is to really lean into that work we did with the airbrush, all of that nice gradient, that nice change from light to dark that we have with the grey and then the white, and let that do all the work and show through the colour. So really making use of the underpainting. And I really want to concentrate on all of this through all the robes on this miniature. It will save loads of time, make a really nice smooth finish at the end, I hope, and just really simplify this whole paint job, but still look quite cool. I've got a lot to paint for this army, and little techniques like this really help. You can see here I'm just taking my time, really slowly building up those layers, making sure they're smooth, no pooling, moving them out. I'd rather go back and do a second layer rather than put too much paint on and leave marks that I then have to go back and spend a lot of time highlighting afterwards. Now we'll be going back and highlighting, but I want this really nice base layer to start with. So we've got the insides of his cloak here, we've got the inside of some of his robes. It's not all going to be this green, I'm going to be using some blues as well, but I really like the way this is looking already, making sure that when I go back and add paint, and I'm adding a little bit more of that gut ripper all the time, a little bit less medium, I'm just reinforcing the shadows rather than the highlights, so a little less highlighting to do at the end. So this is contrast frost art with some medium as well and water, in exactly the same process. So it's thinned quite well, lots of control over it, starting it within the recesses more and then slowly smoothing and blending it out over the whole of this cape. And I want this cape to be really quite striking. You can see the shadow that's there, that's built up with that airbrush. I really like the look of that, and I want that to show through. I don't want to have to build that back in with too much highlighting and layering and feathering and all the other techniques afterwards. So you're kind of working in reverse and using the work with that airbrush. It does mean that you need to be quite disciplined with this, and you can see me smoothing it out, making sure it's not pooling anywhere, making sure there's no tie marks. But it's incredibly easy to do once you've played around with this a few times, and you're just adding these really thin layers, tinting it, and I'll just slowly build that up, making sure that all that underpainting is still showing through. And while that's drying, I go around to the front of the miniature, and there's much less blue showing, but I'm just using the same techniques as I did on the back. You've got little areas between those puffy, rough sleeves that he's got, so half green, half blue. Back to the cloak now, it's dried again, slowly building it up, starting in those shadows in those recesses again as before returning to the front again and repeating and slowly building it up again and again. Now we have Trusty Skeleton Horde, one of my favourite contrast paints, again on the wet palette, so I can control it a little bit, not using medium here, just using some water. And you've got lots of paper scrolls, you've got pages on books that both the wizard and the familiar are carrying as well, and this is just a really nice base for all of those over that zenithal prime. Now we have Briar Queen Chill and contrast medium again and water on that wet palette, so exactly the same method as we did for the previous blue and the green, and to some extent to the Skeleton Horde as well. Really light glazing, allowing the white to really show through here. I want this to be a kind of off-white, off-bluey grey kind of wizard's cloak, and that's a terrible description. I'm well aware of it. But I want that zenithal to show through and do all that heavy lifting, so I can go back and just do some very subtle highlights at the end. And I really want it to stand out as a light colour compared to the books he's holding, compared to his face and that kind of thing. And then this is apothecary white to really stick to that light pastel kind of theme for both of them. And they both got white hair, so they're aging, as I've already mentioned. For the wizard, the familiar, I don't know if he's was a gnome that's alive, whether he's been magically conjured as a familiar, who knows what the story is behind him. But I want them to look like a pair. I want them to go together, almost like the gnome is a image of the wizard himself, so the same colour hair, very bright white, greying to a little bit, but more white than grey. So Cygor brown, boar hide and fur cloak, a really nice combination for doing leather, and I do this a lot on my miniatures. I want to leave all of those other colours I did on the flowing capes and the hair and things to dry before I highlight them. I'm going to come back right at the end because I want them to look super clean, so I can get on with the rest of the miniature now, painting in the smaller details. So everything that's going to be leather, so we've got belts, boots, your little strap here and there, odd a bit of leather on the staff or on the handles of the swords. I'm painting that in with the Cygor brown as a nice base. Now we're on to the boar hide and fur cloak, which is Doombull brown and Tuscal fur if you're looking for Citadel equivalents, and they're very close to that. I'm just building up the highlights now. So that mid-tone first, I'm just doing some little scratches and little marks on the book, so focusing around the edges as clear lines, and then on the centre of the book, on the flat where the book may have been well thumbed, handled, knocked about, just some little scratches and marks just to raise that colour a little bit in the centre. The same goes for the leather around the handles and the wizard's staff. They've got pattern there, so I'm just aiming for the raised areas, leaving that Cygor brown in all those recesses. For areas like the scabbard, it's a matter of doing some thinner lines towards the top, just really picking it out, almost edge highlighting in some regards. And for the leather belts and strapping, I very simply highlighted either side, a very common technique that you see with a lot of Citadel style painting. As we return to the book, we're returning to that very top highlight, and it's very much the same as before, just a little bit less, with slightly thinner line around the edge, slightly thinner line along the top, and slightly smaller scratches, so you can see both previous layers beforehand. And that really just helps the book have multi-tone, make it look like it's highlighted, but also give the appearance of a worn leather cover. And of course, that same technique follows around the rest of all of those brown areas. This is contrast wild wood, and I've just used this on a little bit of rope that's wrapped around the side of the scabbard of his sword, holding a couple of parchments in place. Just a thin layer all over, and it looks pretty cool as it is, but I do come back and highlight a little bit later on. Then it's a matter of working on the books, and I want to make a few different colours, so I kind of made up these little triads, starting with a contrast, and that's orc flesh and a couple of two-thin coats greens afterwards. So just the thin layer of the contrast all over, make sure it's nice and even, and then just build up a first and then second highlight, just the same way as I did with all the leather areas. Another book, another colour, and this is Flesh Terror's contrast, and then Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red, which would be something like Mephiston Red and Evil Sons if you're using Citadel paints for those highlights, but exactly the same method again. Contrast base, then a mid-tone and a highlight with those other paints. You can obviously pick whatever colours you feel suits best for the books if you're following along at home. I chose this little combo for a blue book, so again adding another colour book to the combination. At this stage I decided to paint in a few details on the open book, had a little bit of red on the palette, so just painted in a little mark to represent a big sort of calligraphy letter in there, and then just use a little bit of contrast Black Legion just to paint a few squiggles in to represent the text on those pages. This is Ares Flesh, Ivory Tusk and Trooper White two-thin coats paints, but you can use any really light beige kind of brown colour, a cream colour, and then more of a purer white. And we've got these on the wet palette, they're all thinned, about 50-50 with water, and I'm using them for multiple things around the miniature. So just the Ivory Tusk on its own for this first layer, I'm highlighting that little bit of rope that we painted with the wild wood earlier on. And then afterwards I move on and add a little bit of Trooper White to the ends of some of the strands just to really make it pop and stand out. Then for all the paper and rolled up parchment, so that's the pages of the books and all the parchment that's rolled up on both miniatures, I'm using the ivory tusk and the trooper white to build up a couple of layers just to highlight really. I don't want to completely obliterate the skeleton horde contrast paint that's there because it looks pretty cool as it is already, so very often I'm just focusing on as a bit of an edge highlight and then going back in with the white to really make it pop on the edge. Occasionally I want to lighten it slightly, so I thin it and just feather it out into the main body area of one of the scrolls or something like that. The detail of the pages of the books is actually quite chunky and segmented in quite a strange way. So it's quite easy to paint though. So I've gone around with both of those paints, the ivory tusk first, and then a few little dots of white just to make them stand out a little bit more. And then using just the trooper white, I'm highlighting the moustaches and big bushy eyebrows on the familiar and the beards of both the wizard and the familiar. So it's really just a case of focusing on the detail at its highest points. We've already got the apothecary white glaze on there already, so that's all in those shadows, so it's just kind of tidying up the raised areas a little bit and making them pop. Did add a few little squiggles and marks here to the magical balls that are on both of these staffs, and the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to glaze over the top of it and I want them to show through a bit like there's a whirling vortex inside. So this is Skeleton Horde, some Mantis Warriors green and Cygor brown, but you can kind of achieve this with any similar colours. On the wet palette, slightly thinned, at least a third water for each, and I'm just wet blending them on all of the wooden boxes and things and little pallets that the poor familiar is carrying around, and by wet blending them you get this really nice silvered wood effect. Now those little white squiggles that I put on the end of those staffs is dry, I can come in with Eldari Emerald, which is a greenish tinged blue I'd say, or a bluish tinged green, and it just goes over really nicely and just shows a little bit of those squiggles through, and starts to look like something that's magical on a swirling globe. But then afterwards, just to really add a little bit of extra touch, I'm adding a slightly different green to the edge. So I'm going to come back with a bit of warp lightning, but just to the very tops of those balls while it's still wet, to blend it in a little bit and really make the tone change. Now at this point I realised I hadn't painted the little frog that's on the back of the familiar, and there's also one poking out between the book that the wizard is holding as well. I didn't want to go with green frogs, we've got lots of green on the miniature as it is, I wanted something to stand out. So I like the idea of those bright poisonous frogs you get in the Amazon rainforest, so I went with Iandan yellow contrast paint. Goes over the underpainted miniature really nicely, settles into those recesses, but it's quite striking. So now we're returning to those original colours for all the flowing robes, and then we have some white as well. So we're mixing the white in with the contrast paints and then adding a bit of water as well on the wet palette, and it's really quite thin, but I want it to be. I really don't want to put big thick brush strokes on the miniature at this stage. Right at the top of the video I talked all about how I spent that time with the airbrush getting a nice smooth layer of gradient for the underpainting so that the contrast glazes would do all the work, and they look pretty cool. So this is really just kind of tidying it up and making it pop a little bit more. So we're just adding very subtle edge highlights in most cases, and we're literally just pairing up each of those colours with the white on that wet palette and going back and building those subtle highlights in. So you can see me here working on the blue using the frost heart colour. The larger body of work is on the back of this cape because there's such a large smooth area, so this is where I'm taking my time a little bit more. Very little on the brush and also very thin as well. You can see me here just enhancing those highlighted lines, so using the edge of my brush for where the light is hitting on those really raised areas, but then also blending it out and really feathering it out so we don't end up with any really striking thick brush marks. I really want that to look pretty smooth, and it's probably one of my favourite parts of this miniature, and the way it came out is the blue on the back of the cape. I think it's quite striking and really stands out. And much more of the same when we get to the gut ripper and the white mix for those green areas of the clothing. Focusing a lot of white here at the top of the cape there where it's blowing up and it's right in your face, but it's the highest point, so that's a little bit lighter. Then allowing it to remain a lot darker down in the shadows, which seems pretty obvious. Same with the big collar at the back, just allowing it to be a little bit lighter at the top. I don't want to get too light because it's got white edges on it as well, so we need to make sure there is a definition there, but just adding a thinner, lighter green line around the top and then blending it back in a little bit. As I get round to sort of the body of his flowing robes around the bottom, again just allowing those darker greens to remain towards the edges and the recesses a little bit more, but lightening towards the centre. Time we get to the edges, I'm just using pure white here, so very much the edge of my brush, picking up the edge of the cape and all those flowing robes. Now the studio paint job has lots of gold edging around it, but I didn't want to add too much of that. I quite like the idea that it's all fabric rather than sort of gold plating or anything like that, so I'm sticking with that white sort of edging all the way around. That continues with all the details on the cuffs and around those puffy sleeves as well. Just by edging it in white, just really tidies it up and makes it pop and stand out a bit more. On to the finishing touches now. A nice little cheat is using a little bit of gloss varnish on areas you want to look shiny, so on these magical crystal balls, and then it's on to the metallics. So we have Viking Gold and Elven Gold here, one of my favourite ranges of paints, Scale 75 metallics, and I just want to make sure that these golds are pretty cool, and I know the way these golds work, so I'm going back to my old favourites for this paint job. Now, while he doesn't have any gold edging on his clothing, I wanted to make every metallic part gold on this miniature, apart from the two chains that are holding his spell book to his waist. So it's a case of going around all the remaining areas that are unpainted and adding in this gold colour. Very much the same for the familiar as well, at least for all the nice kit he's holding anyway. So the sword, I painted it as if it's in a scabbard. I know the studio paint job there's no scabbard and it's painted as the blade, but I figured if he's got it on his back it would be in a scabbard like that. I don't think he's holding his own blade, so if it was the wizards it would be well looked after. But we got gold edging on the edges of the books and around this secondary staff as well. The only place I'm not going to put little gold edging on will be the edges of the boxes and anything holding them. And once that base layer is down, with the Necro Gold is going back with that Elven Gold, which is the highlight. I'm just looking where the light would catch and the angle of the staff, where the light would hit the most there. I'm just adding some nice edge highlighting and really just picking it out and making that gold pop. So this is Coat Silver and Mithril Blade from Tooth and Coat. So you're looking at Lead Belcher and Stormhost Silver, something like that, a little combination. And there's not much on the wizard, as you mentioned, just painting in the chains first. But as we get on to the familiar, you've got the edges on a lot of those wooden crates, and then also some of the buckles or the leather straps that are holding those crates as well. But there's definitely far more gold on these miniatures than there is silver. But once that base layer is down, we just go back with that lighter silver and just pick out the odd little edge here or there just to make it pop a little bit. I'm using a little bit of Spirit Stone Red here just for that jewel that's on the wizard's sort of crown or around his forehead. A really nice, easy way to make it look like a jewel without having to paint in loads of highlighting. This is army painting at its best. To shade the metallics, I'm using a ready mixed oil wash. This is grease colour, which is a kind of mix between a mid-brown and a sepia colour. And I'm just painting into the recesses on all of the metallic areas. So focusing on the gold, of course, most, but all over. The oil wash runs into the recesses really well and doesn't tend to settle on the flat surfaces like a standard wash does. But if it does, I can come back and clean it off afterwards, which is exactly what I'll be doing in the next stage. And to do that, you can use something like this, which is AK Fast Drying Thinner. You do want to use artist stuff, because otherwise it can be a little bit too harsh on your paint. You do want to use old brushes for this, but it's really nice. You can just clean it off the flat areas and it maintains in those recesses. Shades really nicely like a standard wash does, but just gives a really cool effect. Getting right towards the end now, so I've decided to use a little bit of rust effect on some of the metal buckles on those crates. I figured everything else would be super well looked after, but a little bit of rust effect here or there actually adds a little bit of character. Then it's very much a matter of finishing off the bases with a scheme that matches the rest of my army, adding tufts and things like that, and adding a little bit of mud effect. I do add a little bit of that mud effect up the back of the cape. I do like my miniatures to look like they're within their environments. Some people prefer something much cleaner, but I can't resist it, and I think it does look pretty cool. I don't want to mess it up too much. Like I already said, the cape was one of my favourite parts of the miniature, so I don't want to completely destroy it, but a little bit of mud here and there doesn't hurt at all. But that's them all done, edge of the basing, and let's look at some proper pictures. Well, they were fun, especially the familiar. Love that miniature. It's got so much character, and they're ready for my army. I've still got an awful lot to do by the end of February, by mid-February really, because I'm away on holiday a week before the event. But I am very much looking forward to getting this Nuln army done. And if you hadn't already watched the video where I talk about launching the army and what I'm going to do, what the plans are, I'll pop a little link in, so do go and check that one out. And there will be a few updates using YouTube Shorts and things as well. But I'm pretty happy with him. He'll be fine for my army. He'll stand out quite well because he's not wearing black like the rest of them. But it's a really lovely miniature. So Games Workshop have done a fantastic job with this miniature. The sculptor has done a brilliant job. And I think people agree, because he's the only one that's sold out, I think. At least of the Wizards anyway. So I think people are very, very, very fond of this one, and looking forward to getting hold of him when he comes back into stock. So if you are unlucky and you haven't managed to get him, do hit that email me button, because it really does work. It helps them know what they need to restock with. And you do get an email when it comes back into stock. It's definitely helped me get things in the past as well. I got my Elise de Shard that way.
As always, thank you very much for watching. That miniature is awesome. I really, really love it. It's obviously part of my Nuln army now that I'm taking to Throne of Skulls, if I can get it finished on time. So really, really fun to paint. It was really fun to choose a different scheme that stood out from the rest of the army, and hopefully some of the colour choices and techniques and things that I've shown you in the video that you may find useful, maybe the odd thing you want to take into your own painting. If not, and many of you are far better painters than I am, hopefully you just enjoyed watching the video and listening to me rabbit along and joining me for the ride. If you did enjoy the video, please do give it a like, give it a comment below. It genuinely really helps. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. There's lots of old world content already on there, and will be lots more. I will be doing more with those other miniatures I've shown you. I'll be working on Harold Gemminson as well, and I've got some High Elf Seaguard bits planned with the High Elves on the way soon. The old world content will continue to come thick and fast over the coming weeks and months, but also check out the other things on the channel, as well as lots of other games covered, and I will continue to cover other games and other game systems from other manufacturers as well. You can support the channel even more by checking out my Patreon. It really does help me keep doing what I do. It takes a lot of time to record these videos and to edit, and anything that helps me cover the cost I have of time spent doing that is always really helpful. I've got affiliate links in my video description as well, and I have my t-shirt store if you want to pick up some merch. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.
How very dare they? Well, I won't be staying in that establishment. So are we going to meet your old boss tomorrow? Oh my, his face is very familiar. He looks like you.